Hello students, my name is Mr. Popovsky, and today, in Modern Music Theory, we will be going over early rock and roll from the 1950s through to the 1960s. By the end of our lesson, you should be able to do a few things. First, you should be able to identify a rock chord progression and how that differs from music we listen to today. Also, you should be able to name a few historical events related to the birth of rock and roll, and how these not only changed rock and roll itself and formed it, but changed music as a whole. And finally, you should be able to recognize what instruments are used in the rock and roll genre and how they paved the way for different music in the future. Let's get right into the history of early rock. As with most modern musical genres, rock and roll found its roots in R&B, jazz, and country. From the 1930s all the way through to the 1950s, these genres ruled the American landscape. They coincided with a mixing of different cultures that occurred in America at this time. Many radio stations were now more focused on providing music for all cultures. This resulted in many people who had never heard jazz before listening to it daily and enjoying it. Although it is up to speculation and is a hotly debated topic, the first real rock and roll album is considered to be Jimmy Preston's Rock the Joint from 1949. However, the rock and roll style was not set in stone for a long time, and even though Rock the Joint exhibits some elements of rock and roll, it does not exhibit all of them. The first album to exhibit almost all elements of rock and roll into a single package was Rock Around the Clock by Billy Haley and His Comets, which was recorded in 1954. This album is a benchmark and milestone in the history of rock and roll, and can be considered its true birth. Early rock was very different from the genres that encompassed it during that time. Rhythm and blues, jazz, and country, as mentioned before, were kings, and all had similar elements, including slow, flowing musicality and large instrumentation. With jazz especially, big bands were a large part of their popularity. However, once the war economy came into play, large instrumentation was cut in favor of small ensembles. This was great for rock, especially since its ensembles were small to begin with. Rock usually used an electric guitar and bass, drum set, vocals, piano to some extent, and maybe even some brass, including trumpet or saxophone. Rock also featured quick, repetitive sections that were very easy to follow. Not only were they easy to follow in terms of listening to the music, but also in terms of chord progressions, which we will get into in a moment. Unlike the complicated chord progressions of jazz and R&B during that time, early rock tended to have a very simple chord progression that it utilized almost all the time. As we've talked about before, the normal chord progression of today's simple music is 1 to 4 to 5 to 1, with the 4 acting as a predominant to the 5, and the 5 leading into the 1. However, rock and roll used a 12-chord progression. For the first 4 chords, it is all repeated 1 chords, followed by 2 4 chords, and then another 2 1 chords, creating a plagal cadence. The last 4 chords go in the opposite order that you would think. The 5 leads into the 4, and then back to the 1. As you can see, all of these chords are major, leaving no room for minor or diminished sonorities. This kept the format very simple, albeit different, and allowed the listener to easily follow chord progressions as they came along in the music. Here are some questions to consider about the information we talked about today. What was considered the first rock and roll album? Is this a unanimous thought? What kind of instruments are used in early rock? What about the style of early rock makes it different from jazz? What usual chord progression does early rock utilize? What does this do for the listener? On these next few slides are examples of some early rock and roll staples. The first being Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry, one of his most influential and popular songs. Here we have Billy Haley and his Comets performing Rock Around the Clock, which was mentioned earlier as a huge milestone for rock and roll. Finally, we have Elvis Presley performing Hound Dog. If you listen closely, it is very easy to identify the 12-chord progression that we discussed earlier. Thank you so much, class, for listening today. I hope you had fun learning about early rock and roll. In our next lesson, we will be going over the midpoint of rock and roll, leading into the late. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.